Today's daf is Masechta Horayos Daf Gimel, and this is Thursday. So the last thing we learned was we're talking about if a bezin makes a psak and people follow the ruling. If it's a majority of people follow the ruling, then the bezdin has to bring us a carbon, and the people we had an argument whether they bring a carbon as well or not. Our Mishnah says they're exempt. Then the people don't bring a carbon, but if a minority of the people follow the bezin does not bring a carbon, and then we had a machlekes whether the minority people do bring their own carbon. Our Mishnah says you don't, and we said that follows Rabbi Yehuda, and the other Mishnah follows the Chachamim says that you do. And then we also said possibly it's Rab Meir and the Chachamim. We definitely vetoed that, and we said with Rab Meir and the Chachamim are arguing about something totally different. And we gave a number of possible explanations of what they're arguing, and has nothing totally unrelated to our Mishnah. We said that Me'acham both agree that if minority of the people follow the bezin, and the bezin does not bring a carbon, neither do they bring a carbon. And we said a number of ways of understanding your argument. Either if it's exactly half and half, and if you add the bezin to the half, it'll become a majority. So Rameir says that you don't do that. They are potter for bringing that special carbon that the bezin brings, and the Chachamim say that you do. Or we said that what happens if Bezin Paskin and the majority of the people followed, so the Bezin brings a carbon. What about the people themselves? Do they bring a carbon? So Rab Meir says that they're potter for bringing a carbon with the people because the Bezin is bringing, and the Chachamim, which is Rav Shimon, they say that the Bezin brings and so too the people bring. Another one we said is that if one tribe not the kol, but a tribe. There's a tribe, a shevet called a kol, which we'll learn about later in the Gemara. Rameir says no, and therefore they don't bring a carbon. They have potter. The bezin is potter for bringing a carbon, and the normal didn't apply. And what do you call it? The people are potter as well, or not, depending on the machlekes we just spoke about. Or and what do you call it? And Rabbi Yehuda says that they are chayva. That if Rabbi Shimon says, sorry, Rabbi Yehuda says that if a shevet has their own bezin, they're considered a kol. And the last thing we said was majority of the kol. Whenever you have six shvatim, but the majority of people, or majority of shvatim, but minority of people, is that considered a kol? And Mary says no. You are pot the business pot for being a carbon, and the chachamim say that you are chayk, and this follows you of Shimon and Elazar. So now we're saying, how do we determine the rave kol, the population? Do we look at Jews around the world? In which country? Says the Gemara. We are up to the first wide line of Gimel Amud Aleph. Omar Abasi, or the last narrow line, Abasi said, when it comes to deciding what's considered a call, we only follow the dwellers of Eretz Yisrael itself. How do we know that? Shneimar says, Ayash Shleima Beisahi, Shleima made at that time when they finished the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, as a Chag Yom Tov, the whole Yisrael, all the Jews are with him. Kahal Gadol, an unbelievable group, a large group, Melavei Hamas ad Nachal Mitzrayim. From he delineated the place where it's from, and he says Melavei Hamas until Nachal Mitzrayim. You already said B'chol Yisraelim, or what else you have to say? Lifnei Hashem Elokeinu. She was yummy. My boss gave him a total of 40 days. Mechtik si B'chol Yisraelim, Kal Gadol, Melavei Hamas, Am Nechel Shalom. We have to mention that further. You said Kol Kol. Shema, I may not tell you. Whenever it says Kol, we only look inside the boundaries of Israel. How did he get Kol? Only within the boundary of Israel is called Kol. Aval Hanach Leikir Kol, but the rest is not called Kol. Says the Gemara. An interesting machlekes, a question. Before we get into the question, there's a machlekes between Rav Shimon and Chachamim. And what happens was a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi, if they committed a sin in error, they bring a totally different kind of a carbon than an ordinary person. So what happens if a Kohen Hedjit committed an Aveda, and then by the time he realized that he did an Aveda, he became a Kohen Gadol? So do we look at the time when he sinned or the time that he found out? So we have as follows. Chachamim say, we look at the time that he sinned. And if he was a hedjit, he brings the carbon of a hedjit, whatever the carbon is for a hedjit, for an ordinary person. Rabbi Lezer says depends. If he found out before he became a Kohen Gadol, then he brings as a regular person. If he found out after he became a Kohen Gadol, then he is potter. Then he's totally potter. So now, taking that in mind, you look at the time of the sin or the time when you found out. We go now back to our question. Remember, we need a roiv call before we say that the bezin has to bring a carbon. So the Gemara has an interesting question. Says the Gemara, Pshita, there's no question. Merubin, majority of people committed an Aveda, they follow the Bezin, but then with a smart, a number of people died and suddenly they became the minority. Then the question is, do we say, well, at the time of the sin, they were majority, the time they found out they were minority, so that would be Machlek, the Chum of Shimon. The they look at the time of the sin, they were majority, and therefore the Bezin brings a carbon. And according to Rab Shimon, you look at the time you found out. Now the minority, the Bezin does not bring a carbon. Simple as that. Hi, no pluk to Rab Shimon Rabban. The question is all the way around. At the time of the sin, they were a meat, so the bezin doesn't bring a carbon. But the time they found out, a number of people who did not commit the sin died. So now suddenly they became the riba, they became the majority. Do we say now the bezin is chayiv a carbon? Do we say me plig Rab Shimon Rabban? Rab Shimon does also Rab Shimon said you go after when you found out mechayiv, and therefore in this case also when the time you found out you were the majority, so bezin is chayiv. Rabban and does he basa chator Rabban? So you look at the time they sinned and they were minority, then potter bezin is potter. Is that how you look at it? Or maybe not. So the Gemara, what's it? No, Tizbra doesn't make sense. What's Rab Shimon saying here? In the case of Rab Shimon, you sinned at the time when it was an Aveda and you were chayv as a hedjit, and then you found out as a hedjit. So he says you got to bring a carbon. You found out when you're no longer a hedjit, you found out when you became a kohen, you are potter. But you were chayv at the time of the sin, and you're chayv at the time you found out. Over here, in this case over here, you were a meat at the time of the sin. You were potter. You only found out when you were majority making a chayv. Rav Shimon doesn't say that when you sinned at a time when you potter, now you found out, therefore we're going to make you chayiv. No one says that. So when it says over there, but yediyah at a time when the time of the sin it wasn't avera. Who said that you're chayiv? In case if you are laisik yehashta. So how come Rav Shimon says that you sinned when you were a hedjit and then you found out after you became a kohen gadol, then you are potter? Why? If it goes after yediyah and we don't care if you're chayiv or potter, you should be chayiv now as a kohen gadol. Is a raya? No, the trigger is always when you sinned, and the question is also when. But you had to know as well at the same time. That's all. And Rab Shimon Chatav boy, you need both. We have a series of questions here, interesting questions regarding combinations, combining. Right, you remember you need a majority before the bezin is chai. So what happened? The bezin chayil mutter. The bezin declared that teifa fats is mutter. Also me a minority people followed it. Then the chazur bezin behen, and then the bezin again. First the bezin then changed and retracted, and then then they passed it again a couple of weeks later that it's mutter. Another group of people followed. If you combine the two groups, you have a majority. Or do we say each one is in isolation? Kiven the shtei yediyas need two separate incidents. They don't combine. Kiven the idi chaylevu. They're both talking about the same subject and it's fats. Mitzdarif. They combine, and now you have a majority, and therefore the bezin should bring. The intim tzelema, if you can argue, kiven the idi b'chaylevu, is talking about the same sin. Mitzdarif that you combine. What about me? So it's both chaylev, but different parts, different avedas. This is the chaylev that's on the more me bechaylev gabe dakinis on the intestines. Hachavada here surely keeping the betray kroy kosi. They're two different avedas. So therefore, they don't combine. Each one was a minority, and therefore the bezin is potter, even though they made a mistake. Or keeping the bechaylev at the end of the day the same name, fat, safer fats, they combine. And the imtim tzelema. And even if you want to say that Shem Chaylevu Mitzvah, they both have the same name and they combine. What about Miyad B'Chaylev, Miyad B'Dam? Two different Avedas. One is fats and one is blood. What do we say in this case here? Vadai today is the two separate Avedas, Dam, Chaylev, and B'Kivin the Ein Sunan Shavle Mitzvah, because the two separate Avedas they don't combine, and therefore a minority, and therefore the bezin is potter. Idealma Kivin the Sunan Shavle. The Aveda is the same, the Lav, and the Kabbalah Shavle, and the carbon is basically the same. Mitzvah, they do combine. Do we say keeping the kabbalah the same carbon mitzvah they combine? What about me bechayil me b'chalim? What about two separate avedas? This is a chayil, this is a different carbon you bring all together. What's it in here? Hachavada here surely ain't yisunin shava, they ain't kabbalah shava. Two different avedas, two different kabbalas, they don't combine. Minority. Bezin is exempt. Adilma keeping the edi chorus, so they both ultimately have chorus. We did it deliberately. Maybe mitzvah they have something in common. You combine. It's a majority that Bezin made a mistake. Teiku, remain with the question. Another question similar. Bezin declared that type of fats is mutter, but also minority people followed it. Okay, so Bezin is exempt. But then umeis oisei Bezin, that particular Bezin died, but Ahmed Bezin Acha, another Bezin who took their place, stood up. The chazru v'horu, they made the same psak. And but also everybody followed. What happens here? Do we a miyat acha? Another miyat followed. Do we say? Do they combine or not? So the Gemara said like this: there's actually an argument who brings the carbon. Until now, we've been saying the whole time the Bezin brings the carbon of the majority, but actually that in itself is a machlekes. One opinion says the Bezin brings the carbon, and there's another opinion that said that the tzibur, the public, the people who actually sinned, they're the ones who bring the carbon. So Liba, the Mandama, Bezin, Maisi, the one who says the Bezin brings the carbon, how can you combine? Half of the previous Bezin is dead, the previous meal is dead, they cannot be involved in the carbon, so there's nothing to talk about. Late to Bailach, the lesson they're not around anymore. Our question is, what about if the opinion says that's a tzibur, and that the tzibur are all in existence still, but just the Bezin died? Do we say, well, the tzibur is still here, even though it's two different botche dinin, since it's the same psak, the same tzibur, we combine the two, it's a majority or not? Mike, do we say tzibur hakai, they're here? Or perhaps the idea that who bezin the hayru be in them. We need that the same bezin should be involved as well. Two different botche dinin, they don't combine. Take remains the question. I'm going to be honest. Rabbeinu said, "Meya she yoshlu lahaydas." If 100 people sat down to paskin, remember we said before it had to be the Sanhedrin Gedolah. But let's say other people were there as well involved. Ain't chayav in the They're all involved in the discussion. You're not chayav until there's unanimous agreement that this is mutter. How do I know that has to be unanimous? It says in Pasuk, the im kol adas Yisrael. It doesn't say adas, it says kol. I mean everything, everyone. The entire Eden, they made a mistake and they forgot that this is us. They all made a mistake. Till they all made a mistake. Till it spreads everywhere. It makes sense. Generally speaking, we have a rule like a kula. Over here, it says kol ha'eda. Why does it kol ha'eda? Just say eda. Why does it say to stress the kol? Say that even there's 100, every single person has to be one. You need a unanimous decision. You need everyone to be involved. There's an interesting question Achrein for and others ask. If Rubai Kekula, generally speaking of Rubai Kekula, then why by a kos, by kiddush, let's say you need a revius, have a majority of a revius in your cup and say Rubai Kekula, majority is good enough. So they say that Rubai is only Kekulai from Kulai. That you have a Kulai there. If Rav say one way, we'll follow the Rav. But over here you don't have a Kulai. The cup is 3/4 full, another quarter is empty, so it's not rubai kekulei. Anyway, so the Gemara right now is under the impression that if it says kol, it means all of it. So the Gemara, tonight we learned how the Bezin rule. The Yodech mentioned, oh, I tell me, one of the people there knew that they made a mistake, but hold up, and he yet follow the Bezin. Now this person knew they made a mistake, obviously didn't consent with them. Knew it wasn't unanimous. So what's he saying that the Bezin has to bring a carbon? Beisha also was iman, whether they follow with them. Beisha also was a chayim after them. Beisha also was he did on his own. He's a chayiv. He's chayiv his own carbon. Beisha told Bezin he didn't rely on them. Seems to me, who the chayiv? He's chayiv. Anybody else follows the Bezin the potter because Bezin paskin. But you just said it's not a psak unless they all agree. But not everyone agreed. Even though he didn't agree in his heart of hearts, he knew they were wrong. He didn't have the courage or the guts to say anything, so he just nodded his head like everybody else. So therefore, there was a unanimous decision. Toshma coming is something similar. How the Bezin passing the Yodech mentioned, they knew that he made a mistake. Ramalan tell you not to make a mistake. Here he told them openly they made a mistake. How they looked to him. The time, the only reason is Ramalan tell not to him. He clearly said openly, you guys are making a mistake. Therefore, there's no hurry the Bezin. The Pturim. So because people can't even rely on a Bezin because if somebody openly advocated a position that it's awesome. Hashasi, he would have said nothing. Mishtik, Chayav, they'd be Chayiv. He didn't agree with them. The Gamaleira and the Psak came out in conclusion, but he didn't agree with them. But my Bola, not all of them agreed. Amri Hachanam will say the same thing. He nodded with his head. He didn't have the temerity to come out against them. Mostly, Rav Mishashi asked the question. We learned in Avodah Zarah. Some Churafa said we relied on we learned about oil and other things. And an important rule when it comes to Gzeir. So we had the Masechta Avodah Zarah that when it comes to oil, that they first they asked it and then they from a goy and then they retracted. Anyway, it has to be accepted by majority of the people. That's a whole discussion. Made the Gershom. Certain places it wasn't accepted. What happens there? But it says over here that the Gemara says that they said, "Ain't goizing gzeira ala tzibur." You don't make a gzeira decree. Unless most people can accept it. Micro, what's a pasuk? You make all of these rules. Why you stealing to me? Hagoy kulei, all stealing to me. You're making these rules that hagoy kulei that all the people accept, and then you don't follow it. It says Hagoy Kulei, and yet Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik said, and Hashem Gamliel, if the majority of the people. So we see, even though it says Kulei, it doesn't mean everybody, it means majority. The Hagoy Kulei and Berubik Kulei Dami. Tiyufta, the Rabbi Yonasan Tiyufta, Rabbi Yechon Tiyufta. So bottom line, the Gemara concludes, even where it says kol, it doesn't mean all, it means majority, and that is good enough. There's actually an interesting Taz in Hichot Rosh Hashanah, when he says, kol ha'olam kulei b'chveidecha, he wants to say that if there's a double kol, then it means all of it, not just majority. So only regularly we say rubik kulim, and that one says a double kol. So Gemara says, no, my koladas. So why does it say koladas if even majority is good enough? It says if all the Eden made a mistake, why kol? If they're all there, then if the entire Sanhedrin is there, then it's considered hayra. And if not, not. But we don't need them all to agree. Says the Gemara. If 10 people are sitting in the Torah, they all have to share equal responsibility if they make a mistake. Pshita. How come teacher? I feel if you knew there was a mistake, even if a student who's not part of the bed knew there was a mistake and he kept quiet, he's partly responsible. I wouldn't have enough of the Beidin that when he went to Bezdin, Maisi Asara Tanoi, the Beidavla Kamei, he always brought 10 scholars with him so that to make it easier. Why? If they made a mistake, they made a mistake, then he only gets a splinter out of the big piece of wood. In other words, we'll also share responsibility, so everyone gets less of a punishment. Ravashi similarly have a Maisi after the Kamei. They brought him a piece of treif. He would bring 10 shachtim from the city of Mechasya, and he would sit them before him. He said, if we make a mistake, we're all equally responsible, and we all get lesser punishment. Next Mishnah, Bezdin made Paskin, they made a mistake and they realized it. When they retracted, the problem is not everybody heard about their retraction. It doesn't matter whether they brought a kapara before they found out or they did not. But somebody out there didn't hear about the retraction and he followed them. Shimon says, "Potter, he still followed the Bezdin." And Rabbi says, "Suffolk, we're not 100% sure if he followed the Bezdin or not." A suffix, what's a suffix? If he was sitting at home, then he should have known. Then chayiv, then he is chayiv. But if you went to the museum, no, he says a suffix means you bring a carbon asham tali, asham that is dependent. For example, if somebody ate a piece of fat, and afterwards you found out it could have been that it's treif. You don't know it's treif for kosher. So you bring an asham tali, suspended asham until you know otherwise. Here also, we don't know exactly what your intentions are. You're following the Bezdin or not, so you bring an Asham Tali. So if you're at home, Chayiv. So you at least Chayiv and Asham Tali. Halach, because you could have found that, as we'll see. Halach Lemdin is a Yam, you went overseas, Potter completely, definitely it's not your fault. How would you know? I agree with him that if you're overseas, you have Potter. Why? Why are you different sitting at home? So you answered him. Sitting at home, you could have found out. You're overseas. How would you know? So therefore, definitely you are Potter. Now, another very important thing: this whole idea that Bezdin made a mistake is only Bezdin made a mistake in a detail. But if they say there's no such mitzvah as Shabbos, for example, that does not apply. Everyone should have known better. So Hoyre Bezdin Lakers Kol Aguf. If Bezdin says that this mitzvah does not exist at all. For example, Amalei said, "Ain't needed b'teira." No such thing as a needed b'teira, or ain't Shabbos b'teira, or ain't avodah chum avodah zor b'teira. How they look to the potter. But if they said, "Look, there is Shabbos, but not every detail as far as we know," how they and then the chai. For example, Kate said, "Amri, yes, of course, need a b'teira. But let's say she only saw one day, and then following day she doesn't have to monitor to see, and she's permitted. That doesn't apply. She doesn't have to monitor herself. That's a detail, and that's where Hoyle Bezin comes in. Or yes, Shabbos b'teira. But one of the third malachas and carrying, and we think carrying, we're taking from inside outside is not a malacha. Again, that's Hoyle Bezin. Or yes, if you bow down, you are potter. Again, that's a detail, and that's the Hoyle Bezin. As long as only a detail, that's called Hoyle Bezin. If you say the whole Aveda doesn't exist, that's not what we're talking about. Second, my time Reb Shimon. What's the logic of Reb Shimon? Why did Reb Shimon say potter? Very simple. Hoyle b'shut Bezin. Why say he's following the Bezin? He could the other say, Reb Shimon. Kol Hayra she got beroiv. Another reason is any hayra, any psak that went out, most of the tzibur yachid or is a potter. Even though now you're an individual, and you don't know about the retraction of your potter. Why? The Hara was given only to determine, to distinguish between Sheigig and Mezid, that if the Bezin came out and made a wrong ruling, if it wasn't a Bezin, then obviously you're a Mezid, but if you're lying on the Bezin, you're a Sheigig, and you weren't aware of the retraction. Makes ask a question. The part that you bring if the entire community made a mistake and didn't realize an Aveda, see the Avedas Kachavim, and so too the goats that you do for Aveda Zora is betchila. We're talking about if Bezin, let's say, made a mistake when it comes to Avodah Zarah, and everybody followed them, and they Bezin retracted, and now they need money to collect because they did an Aveda, everyone did an Aveda together, and they bring in. You have to bring two kabbonis. You have to bring an oila and a chata, bring a par and a seir, and they're going out to collect money. Where's that money come from? Is that a new donation, or they just take from the general revenue that they collected in the beginning of the Purim time? So the Gemara says. No, you go out and make a new donation. And if you said they don't know about it, so our question is according to Rav Shimon, if people are going door knocking every house and say you have to contribute because Bezin made a mistake, then how can you say you didn't know? What do you mean you put up relied on Bezin? You found out that Bezin made a mistake. So we say, Mai, keeping the gobble have a he knew about it. Says the Gemara, I'll give you a couple of answers. They didn't tell you why they're collecting money. They just said we need money. Not every Mashal tells you exactly why they're collecting money. They just said we need for Kabbanis. Or saying we're going to have a little bit masa. You weren't around in town when they were collecting money, so you had no idea. Or Rav will learn like Idach Tana. There's another version of the Brisa that Savar Tanya Ivcha, exactly the opposite. And that is the names. He just swapped the names. But and you make a new collection. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. But Rav Shimon says, Metrumas Halishcha Hein Boyin. Rav Shimon says, no. We collect from the general revenue. Tanya, we learned, Rameya, Mechayev, Rav Shimon Poitin. Rameya says, you are Chayev, and Rav Shimon says, you are Potter. What's going on is, as the Gemara, Rabbi Lezer says, we're talking about if you Bezin retracted. Rameya says, you have to be Chayev a carbon. You can't rely on Bezin. Rav Shimon says, you're Potter because you're relying on the Bezin. Rabbi Lezer says suffix, it's a suffix. You bring an Asham Toli, right? We don't know exactly if you're relying on Bezin, you're not relying on Bezin, you could have found out. And Sumcha says, Toli. Sumcha says, we're not sure if you did an Aved or not. You don't even bring an Asham Toli. Asham Toli, the difference is according to Rabbi Lezer, you bring an Asham Toli. According to Sumcha, you don't. And why not? Moshel de Rabbi Lezer, what's the logic of Rabbi Lezer? La'odem, a person, she'achal who ate, suffix chelik, suffix shumim. We're not sure if he ate treifa fats or he ate kosher fats. The noidolation may be asham, and he found out that it's a suffix. What do? You bring a carbon asham. But you don't have to say lemanda amad tzibur ma'isa. Remember, we said before there's an argument who actually brings the carbon. The majority make a mistake. Is it the bezin or is it the tzibur? You don't have to mention according to one that says that the community brings it. The mfarsa milsa. If the community brings it, everyone knows that the community brought a carbon. So therefore you bring an ashim tolui. And so therefore, if you would have walked out, you would have known about it. About the retraction. Allah in the mando, but no one says that Bezin Mevi, that the Bezin brings it, so possibly the Lema Farsa Milsa, that it's not Mefursim. Nevertheless, had you asked somebody, how they would have told you. Therefore, there's a possibility that you're liable, and that's why you have to bring Rosh Tali. Rabbi Yasi, the son of Avin, other Rabbi Yasi says, and Mashal the Sumchas, how come Sumchas says you don't bring a carbon Asham Tali? Even though he says it's doubtful whether you really rely on the Bezin or not. The of them, you know what you compare it to? The Adam to a person who has to bring carbon Chatas. Now you have to bring carbon Chatas by day. And the way Rashi learns, even though you're not allowed to bring a carbon after the carbon Tomid Shabbeinu Abayim, but we're just like by carbon Pesach, we allow you to bring a Mechusa Kippurim. For example, before you bring a carbon Pesach, let's say you were Tameh, now you finally went to the Mikvah, anything else, you have to bring a carbon. And you didn't bring your carbon to enable you to eat kachim. You can bring it even after the carbon tamid shabben abayim, because the mitzvah asay of the kippurim pushes away. So maybe other kabbalas, the same thing applies. He brought the carbon chatas after the carbon mincha tamid abayim. So mashal the sumcha is what compared to la'adam shehevi, a person brings a kaparasi, but he brought it bein hashemoshes. He brought it in the afternoon, late afternoon, twilight. Suffering, now we're not sure. Did he bring him by Joyim and therefore he's forgiven? When it's chapala, he's so forgiven. And suffering, did he bring it at nighttime? because it's twilight. We don't know what time, exactly when night comes in. Twilight is a suffix. We had the second painting of Shabbos, all the different sfeikas, so suffix whether it happened when it's dark, and therefore, and maybe there was no kapara here. She'ain maybe Oshim Tov. What do you do? So you don't know whether you're in a schap or not. You don't go ahead. You don't bring another karma chatas, nor do you bring an Oshim Tov in this case. You don't have to mention Lamandama, Bezdin, Mevin, like the Bezdin who brings it. And surely you didn't know. You had no idea that retraction, and it's not your fault. Whose fault? Why are you supposed to ask anybody? So therefore, you're sort of innocent. You don't bring a carbon Oshim Tov. Even want to say that the community brings it. The Mefarsim Milsa, supposedly a lot of people know about it. If you would have asked somebody how they Umrule, if you would have went out of your house, you would have asked, you would have told you, something by Yazor Sheikha, but over here, it's just like you brought a something by day, a something by night. Could be your pot, it could be it was by day, or could be you brought it Bein Hashmoshes, which but still not sure is that considered day or not, because Bein Hashmoshes itself is questionable. Is it the previous day, the following day? So therefore, it's like a fool's fakis. The Ishael, and if you would ask somebody what is now day, night, nobody knows. Nobody around to ask him. So therefore, you're potter from an ashram. The same thing over here. Who said just because you ask people that they would tell you that Bezin made a mistake in this attraction? Therefore, it's such a questionable iser that you don't bring an ashram tali. We'll stop over here and continue mission on Friday. Have a good day.